Liberty Drive, 5th grade. This is Miss Adekoya, and today I'm going to be talking to you about figurative language. So figurative language is language that you use. It's when you use a word or a phrase that does not have its literal meaning, so it's everyday meaning. And writers usually use it in order to make their writing more creative and just add more color to their writing. So we're going to talk about basically the different types of figurative language, why authors, poets, writers in general use them. I'm going to give you some examples and their meanings and give you an opportunity to come up with your own examples. So let's begin. The first one we're going to go over is similes. So right here, I have question stem, a question stem over here. What does the author mean by the phrase? And the reason why this is really important is whenever you have figurative language in a piece of writing, you need to figure out what that writing means, what the figurative language in particular means. So we're just going to keep this question stem in the back of our mind. So similes is when an author compares two unlike things using as or like. And so an example here would be Asta is as sweet as pie. And so the author here is comparing Asta to the sweetness of pie. And what does this mean? It just means Asta is really sweet. Here's another example. Luis runs like a cheetah. So here, the author is comparing Luis to the speed of a cheetah. And can you guess what that means? Yep, you guessed right. Luis runs really fast. Now it's time for you to come up with an example of your own. And I'll give you about a minute thereabout. So remember, you're comparing two unlike things and you want to make sure you include as or like. All right, our next figurative language that we will be looking at today would be metaphors. Again, that question stem, what does the author mean by the phrase? So metaphors, not to confuse them with similes, metaphors also compare two unlike things without using as or like. So here you're still comparing one thing to another thing, but you're removing the words as or like. So here is an example. My class is a beehive. So I know that a beehive is super, super busy. Bees are always buzzing everywhere. Buzz. And so I'm comparing my class to a busy beehive. So I'm just trying to say here, what does the author mean by the phrase, my class is a beehive? It just generally means my class is busy. Here is another example of a metaphor. My dad is a rock. So I know who my dad is. And what do I know about rocks? I know that a rock is usually hard or strong. And so I'm going to ask myself here, what does the author mean by this phrase, my dad is a rock? And so that means my dad is really strong. So he's someone I probably can rely on. And now it's your turn to come up with your example. A little music here to get you thinking. And again, remember that you're not using as or like, and you're comparing two different things. All right, now time to move on to the next one. Idioms. So idioms are usually expressions that have special meanings. They are not literal. So they are not the exact words that are used, but they just have an extra meaning to what is being said. Here is an example. Gerardo put himself in Elijah's shoes. This does not literally mean that Gerardo put on Elijah's shoes or took Elijah's shoes and put them on. It just means that Gerardo had empathy for Elijah. And so he felt how Elijah felt. So going back to our second steps here. And another example here. It's raining cats and dogs. So what does the author mean by this phrase? Generally, the author is just trying to say, it's not saying that if I look onto the sky, I can see dogs and cats falling from the sky. It's saying it's raining really, really hard. And so again, idioms have extra special meanings, and they're not literal. They don't literally mean the exact words that you see in the sentence. It's just trying to pass on a message. And so now it is your turn to come up with your own examples. And another little music here again. Right, I would love to hear some of the examples that you came up with. Just remember to go ahead and put that in your Google Classroom for your teacher so that way we can all review. Another figurative language that we're going to be going over today would be hyperbole. And hyperbole is just generally, that's just exaggeration. And we do that all the time. And so right now we're just making sure that we're conscious of it, and then also realizing that we're using figurative language even in our everyday speech. So here is an example. Your snore is louder than a freight train. If you've heard a freight train before, it is super duper loud. And so here, it's just exaggerating how loud the snore is. It's just trying to say, well, you snore really loud. And here's another example. Sometimes you hear mom, dad, somebody say this to you. I've told you a million times. So here is another example, another exaggeration here, example of hyperbole, saying it a million times. Not literally said it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until you get to a million. Here, the person or the author is just trying to say that they have repeated themselves several times over. So now I'm going to give you a few, about a minute to come up with your own example for hyperbole. Just think to sometimes when something was exaggerated. And some music here. All righty, now to the next one. This one is pretty tricky to pronounce, but we're going to make it through. So we're going to go slow. Onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia. And an easy way to go about it is say, onomatopoeia, wanna be ya. There you go, onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is when you use a word that imitates a sound. And an author would usually use this to allow the reader to hear what's happening in the story. So what's happening in a poem or what's happening in a story. Here is an example. Well, someplace that you might see onomatopoeia a whole lot would be like comic books, especially. Splash! He jumped into the pool. So splash right here is an example of onomatopoeia. And so the author just wants you to hear the sound of the water. Whoosh, the wind blew his hat off his head. And so the author wants me to hear the word whoosh. And so I can imagine, I can hear that very windy day, windy outside. And then it's so windy that the wind blows hat off a person's head. So if you would try to come up with examples of your own, just think of different sounds, maybe a sound a bird makes or a bee buzzing, things like that. And some more music here. All righty. Alliteration. So alliteration is when the same beginning word is repeated in more than two words in a sentence. So I'm looking at the beginning sound. The beginning sound of a word is repeated in more than two words in a sentence. An author will usually do this to draw attention to certain words, and sometimes also it makes the reading flow easily. So here is an example. I want you to pay attention to the j, 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 j sounds. Joyful Jesslyn jolted when her jelly beans fell. So what does the author mean by the phrase? Just means that Jesslyn shook when her jelly beans fell. And here's another popular one. It's Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. And so that's another tongue twister. And here you can see the alliteration. And now it's your turn. Personification is another type of figurative language. When I look at the word personification, I could do a word search and see the word person. All right, so here is when non-human objects are given human characteristics. So for instance, given like a table, a characteristic that a human being would have. So an author usually does this to make objects come alive and to make them more relatable to the reader. So something that you can relate to. Again, with the question stem, what does the author mean by this phrase? Because that's really important. The wind whistled throughout the morning. So we all know what a whistle sounds like. I'm not very good at whistling. Not really good. But it's trying to say here that it was blowing or it was really windy throughout the morning and I could hear sounds. And usually like if you stand outside and it's windy, you can hear sounds in the wind. Another example here, the car danced across the icy road. So here again is where we're given human attributes or characteristics to something that's not human. So the car dancing across the icy road. What does the author mean by this? The author just means that the car was swerving from left to right, that the road was slippery and icy. And now it's time for you to come up with your example. Your turn. All right, to do a quick recap, today we talked about figurative language, the different types of figurative language, why authors use them, or writers or poets use them, We talked about different examples and what they meant, and you came up with your own examples. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope that it's going to help you review figurative language and help you become a better reader and writer.